She stole my family's love, twisted their trust, and cut me out of everything. But she never saw the truth coming. My revenge was silent, unstoppable, and completely devastating. I always believed that families stood on loyalty, trust, and shared history. Mine was no exception. I grew up in a household where my parents often reminded us that integrity mattered more than wealth. They told me countless times that what made our family strong wasn't money or property but the way we supported one another. I carried that belief into adulthood, and for years I thought nothing could ever shake it. I was wrong. Everything began to change the moment my sister-in-law entered the picture. At first glance, she was everything one could admire. She spoke softly, laughed generously, and carried herself as if kindness came naturally. To outsiders, she was the kind of woman people instantly trusted. But to me, there was always something about her that didn't sit right. She seemed too polished, too careful in every word and gesture, as if she were playing a role designed to impress. My parents adored her almost instantly. She knew exactly how to win them over. She praised my mother's cooking, offered to help with chores, and made sure to compliment my father on every small detail of his work around the house. She brought gifts that seemed thoughtful but were calculated to make her look selfless. It didn't take long before they began speaking of her as though she were the daughter they had always wanted. I tried to remind myself that their affection for her didn't mean less love for me, but deep down I could sense the shift. Small changes started creeping into family interactions. At dinners, she would position herself close to my parents, laughing loudly at their stories, leaning in as though she alone understood them. Whenever I spoke, she had a way of redirecting attention, either by adding her own exaggerated tale or by subtly minimizing mine. My parents seemed too charmed to notice. I did. One evening I overheard her on the phone. She was speaking to a friend, her tone far different from the sweetness she displayed in front of us. "They're so easy to win over," she whispered with a smug laugh. "All you need is a little praise and they'll believe you're the best thing that's ever happened to the family." I froze, realizing then that her entire act was nothing more than a performance. Still, I held my tongue, convincing myself that truth always reveals itself in time. Weeks turned into months, and the subtle digs became sharper. She would drop small remarks about how I wasn't as attentive as I should be, how I seemed distracted, or how she was just trying to help my parents in ways I apparently didn't. Each time she delivered these comments with a smile so warm it disarmed everyone but me. My parents began echoing her sentiments, telling me I should spend more time at home, that I should take lessons from her in how to be more caring. It hurt more than I can describe. The true blow, however, came when I learned about the will. I had gone to visit my parents one weekend, and during a casual conversation, my father let it slip. "We've been making some changes, just to secure the future. Your sister-in-law has shown such dedication, and we think it's only fair she be recognized properly." At first, I didn't understand. Recognized? For what? She wasn't their child, she wasn't the one who had been by their side for decades. She had married into the family, yet here she was being spoken of as though she were the backbone of it. I pressed for details, and that's when my mother gently admitted that the inheritance had been restructured. Most of what was once meant for me was now redirected in her favor. She justified it by saying my sister-in-law was dependable, present, and trustworthy. I sat there in silence, trying to process what I had just heard. A lifetime of loyalty to my parents had been dismissed in favor of someone who had perfected the art of manipulation. The betrayal cut deeper than I could ever explain. My entire life, I had worked to make my parents proud. I had stood by them during hardships, cared for them when they were unwell, and sacrificed opportunities to remain close. And yet, none of that seemed to matter anymore. Their trust had been poisoned, and she was the one who had administered the dose. After that revelation, I began noticing how smug she became. Her smiles lingered longer, her laughter louder, as though she had already claimed victory. At family gatherings, she dropped little hints about future plans and taking care of things when the time came. Each word was a reminder that she had secured her position while I had been pushed aside. I considered confronting my parents, telling them what I had overheard, exposing the side of her they didn't see. But I knew it would be useless. They were blinded, enchanted by her carefully crafted image. If I spoke against her, I would only come across as bitter and jealous, which was exactly the narrative she wanted. So I stayed quiet, observing. And the more I watched, the clearer her tactics became. She volunteered to handle my parents' finances, always making it sound like she was just being helpful. She accompanied them to social gatherings, presenting herself as their spokesperson. She even started referring to their home as our home, as though she already owned a piece of it. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. The bond one once thought unshakable was crumbling. My parents, who had always been my pillars, now looked at me through her words, measuring my worth against her orchestrated kindness. I was no longer the devoted daughter but the one who seemed distant and less committed. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it, something stronger began to take root: resolve. She had taken my family's trust and twisted it to her advantage, but she hadn't taken my clarity. I could see her for who she truly was, and I knew one thing with certainty: I wasn't going to let her win. That night, as I lay awake replaying every slight, every manipulation, every stolen moment of affection, a thought anchored itself in my mind. If she had poisoned their hearts against me, then I would poison their trust in her. Not with lies or fabrications, but with truth, truth so undeniable it would dismantle the false image she had built brick by brick. The inheritance wasn't just about money or property. It was a symbol of my parents' faith, of everything I had given to this family. She had stolen it through deception, but I would reclaim it through strategy. And so, as the first act of this betrayal came to a close, I made a vow to myself. I would not fight her with anger. I would not confront her in a way that made me appear petty or jealous. I would dismantle her world slowly, carefully, and thoroughly. The stage was set, and though she thought she had already won, she hadn't realized that the real game had only just begun. After that night, the world around me began to shift in ways that left me both furious and numb. My parents had always been my greatest source of comfort, but suddenly, conversations with them felt foreign. Where once there had been warmth, there was now comparison. Every call or visit came with some mention of how my sister-in-law had helped, how thoughtful she was, how present she remained. It wasn't just subtle praise anymore, it was direct. My efforts, no matter how genuine, seemed small beside hers. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself that kindness didn't have to be a competition. But as weeks passed, the differences grew impossible to ignore. My father mentioned how she had reorganized his finances, calling her resourceful. My mother told me she had been teaching her favorite recipes, saying she was glad someone was paying attention. Those small acknowledgments carried a sting sharper than any insult, because they were layered with the unspoken message: she was stepping into a role that was once mine. Her confidence only grew with every compliment she received. She no longer needed to hide her smirk when our parents praised her. She carried herself with a triumph that she didn't bother disguising. Around me, her remarks became bolder. She hinted that I had always been too busy, too distracted, too independent, while she had the patience to nurture and serve. Her words dripped with false humility, each one laced with poison, but my parents only heard sweetness. One evening, during dinner, the conversation shifted toward family responsibilities. My father remarked how fortunate he felt to have someone like her to rely on. She turned toward me with a smile so wide it was nearly mocking. "I'm just happy to help," she said, her voice sugary. "I know how hard it is for some people to balance everything. Not everyone has the time to put family first." The comment hung in the air like smoke. My parents nodded approvingly, while I swallowed the burn of humiliation. It wasn't just words. She began weaving narratives behind my back. I heard whispers from extended relatives that I had grown greedy, that I was bitter about money, that I didn't respect my parents enough. These weren't accidents. They were carefully planted seeds that grew into perceptions I couldn't control. When I tried to correct them, people looked at me with suspicion, as if I were trying to cover my own flaws. She had positioned herself as the saint and me as the selfish one. The inheritance became more than a legal document, it became a symbol of betrayal. My parents, the two people who had raised me, were now convinced that she embodied loyalty and care while I had somehow fallen short. Every time I thought about it, a rage pulsed in my chest, but I kept it hidden. Outwardly, I forced myself to appear composed, because I knew that anger would only confirm the picture she had painted of me. Inside, though, the betrayal hollowed me out. There was one moment that shattered me entirely. I visited my parents unannounced one afternoon, hoping to spend quiet time with them, only to find her already there, sitting in the living room with her hand resting lightly on my mother's arm as they laughed together. When I walked in, their laughter stopped, and though my parents greeted me kindly, I could see it, the slight awkwardness, the tension of a bond one no longer shared. Later, as we sat together, she leaned close to my mother and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "It's good you have me, isn't it? Someone who really understands what you need." That night, I cried in silence. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about love and recognition, about the years of devotion that had been so easily overshadowed. The betrayal wasn't only in the inheritance, it was in the way my parents now looked at me. They didn't see my sacrifices anymore. They saw her performance, her staged loyalty, her crafted image. I was no longer the daughter who had always stood by them. I was an afterthought. For a while, despair consumed me. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I failed them somehow? Was I truly less than her? I replayed moments of my life, trying to pinpoint where I had gone wrong, but every memory only reminded me of how much I had given. The more I thought, the clearer it became, this wasn't my failure. This was her deception. She hadn't earned their trust, she had stolen it. And she had stolen it deliberately, with precision. The breaking point came when I overheard her speaking again, this time not to a friend but directly to my parents. She spoke as though I weren't even in the house. "I just worry about her," she said in a tone of false concern. "She doesn't seem to have her priorities straight. What if she doesn't really take care of you both in the long run? I don't want to say anything bad about her, but you know how independent she is. I'm just afraid she might not always be here when you need her." I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as my mother murmured in agreement, my father sighing heavily. Every word was a dagger. She wasn't just undermining me anymore, she was rewriting who I was in their minds. She was painting me as unreliable, selfish, incapable of loyalty. And they believed her. I returned home that night consumed with fury, but beneath the fury was clarity. If I confronted her, I would lose. If I lashed out, she would twist it to her advantage, convincing everyone that I was unstable, bitter, jealous. She had built a fortress of lies around herself, and anger wouldn't break it. But truth could. I understood then that I couldn't fight her with emotion. I had to fight her with strategy. That realization gave me strength. I began to observe her more carefully, not just out of anger but with purpose. I noticed the cracks she didn't think anyone would see, the way she avoided certain questions, the way her smile faltered when money was mentioned, the way her stories about friends never quite aligned. She wasn't flawless. She was careful, but she wasn't perfect. There were weaknesses, and I would find them. I thought about the inheritance, about the betrayal, about everything she had taken from me. But more than that, I thought about dignity. She had poisoned my family's trust in me. She had stolen the bond one valued most. My revenge wouldn't be about reclaiming money. It would be about reclaiming myself. I would expose her lies so thoroughly that no one could ever doubt the truth again. That night, I lay in bed wide awake, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense with determination. I whispered to myself words that anchored me: if she poisoned their trust, I will poison their trust in her. Slowly. Silently. Completely. The betrayal had broken me, yes, but from those shattered pieces something stronger was forming. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of hers unraveling. Once the decision was made, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Anger still pulsed beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled me. I had clarity now. My sister-in-law thought she had already won, but she had underestimated me. She believed my silence was weakness, when in truth it was preparation. The first step was patience. I knew I couldn't rush into this. She had spent months weaving her lies, it would take careful planning to unravel them. So I began quietly observing, listening, waiting. I paid attention to every inconsistency, every careless slip of the tongue, every flicker of fear that passed across her face when money or responsibility was mentioned. I wasn't just watching her, I was studying her. It didn't take long before I discovered the first crack. She loved projecting an image of generosity, always boasting about the thoughtful gifts she brought for my parents. But one afternoon, while visiting them, I noticed a bill tucked beneath some papers on the table. It was a notice from a credit card company, demanding payment. The name on the envelope was hers. My parents hadn't seen it yet. She had used their address, hoping to keep the letters hidden. That tiny piece of paper told me everything I needed. Behind the polished exterior was debt, and not a small one. I didn't expose it immediately. Instead, I began collecting evidence. A month later, another letter arrived. This time I quietly asked the mail carrier to hand me the stack before ringing the doorbell. I slid the envelope into my bag, and when I opened it later, it confirmed what I suspected: she owed thousands, far more than my parents could ever imagine. Armed with this knowledge, I moved to the next phase, planting doubt. One evening, while chatting with my parents, I casually mentioned how some people live beyond their means, buying things just to impress others. I didn't name her, but the seed was planted. My father frowned, as though the thought had never occurred to him before. The next secret came through her own carelessness. She loved gossiping, even about the very friends she pretended to adore. At a family gathering, I overheard her mocking one of her closest companions, calling her foolish and naive. She hadn't realized I was nearby, listening quietly. I recorded a snippet of her words on my phone, saving it for later. I knew eventually, those same friends would be useful in exposing her hypocrisy. Piece by piece, I gathered what I needed. I wasn't reckless, every move was deliberate. I began releasing the truth slowly, like drops of poison into water. One evening, while helping my parents clean, I accidentally let one of her overdue notices slip from my purse. My mother picked it up, her eyes widening as she read. I feigned surprise, acting as though I didn't know how it had gotten mixed with my things. She grew quiet, clearly disturbed, but said nothing. I could see the first crack of doubt forming. The next week, I shared the recording of her mocking her friend, but not directly. Instead, I played it quietly on my phone while sitting near my parents, pretending not to realize the volume was on. They overheard the cruel words, their faces falling. My father shook his head. "I didn't think she was like that," he muttered. I said nothing, only tucked my phone away, letting them draw their own conclusions. Each revelation was timed carefully. I never accused, never pointed fingers. I allowed the truth to speak for itself, each piece slowly eroding the image she had worked so hard to build. My parents grew quieter around her, less eager to praise. I watched her confusion grow as her charm no longer worked the way it once did. She noticed the shift and tried harder, showering them with compliments, arriving uninvited to help with chores, speaking in exaggerated tones of care. But the more she tried, the more hollow it appeared. My parents, once blind, now had doubt in their eyes. They began to question the things she said, to hesitate before believing her. The poison of truth was taking hold. The breaking moment came when I revealed the final piece of evidence. I had discovered through a mutual acquaintance that she had taken a loan from someone in town and never repaid it. The person had threatened legal action if she didn't settle soon. I made sure this information reached my parents through a concerned neighbor, not through me. When they confronted her, she stammered, denying, then excusing, then blaming. The perfect mask she wore for so long began to crumble right in front of them. I stood back, silent, watching the collapse. She grew frantic, her voice rising, her excuses piling on top of one another. My parents, for the first time, saw the woman I had seen all along, not the angel of devotion, but the manipulator who had twisted their love for her own gain. By the end of that evening, the doubt was no longer doubt. It was conviction. My parents finally realized the truth, and though they didn't yet say it aloud, I knew the tide had turned. As I left their house that night, I felt the weight lift from my chest. For months, I had carried the burden of betrayal, the ache of being cast aside. Now, the balance was shifting. She had poisoned my place in the family, but I had returned the poison in kind. And this time, the truth was irreversible. The battle wasn't over yet. But for the first time I could see the outcome clearly. Her downfall had begun, and nothing could save her now. The moment of collapse arrived sooner than I expected. My parents, armed with the fragments of truth I had allowed them to see, confronted her in the living room one evening. I wasn't there, but the story reached me quickly. She had tried everything: tears, denial, even anger, but nothing could patch the holes in her carefully stitched persona. The more she spoke, the deeper she dug herself. Her words, once honey-sweet, now sounded shrill, desperate, unbelievable. By the time I visited the next day, the atmosphere in the house had shifted entirely. My father looked exhausted, my mother's eyes heavy with disappointment. They didn't speak of her as they once had, not with pride or affection. Instead, they shook their heads as though discussing a stranger they regretted ever trusting. For the first time in months, they looked at me with clarity, as though a veil had been lifted. She arrived not long after, her steps loud, her voice defensive before she had even crossed the doorway. She accused me outright, claiming I had turned everyone against her, that I was jealous, bitter, ungrateful. But my parents silenced her. My father's voice, firm and steady, cut through her protests. Enough. We've seen who you really are. Her face crumpled in disbelief. She had relied so heavily on her performance that she couldn't fathom it failing. She tried to twist the story again, but the evidence was undeniable. The debts, the lies, the gossip, the selfishness, too much had been revealed. My mother told her, quietly but firmly, that trust once broken cannot be mended with excuses. For the first time, she had no answer. The will was changed shortly after. My parents restored what was once mine, making it clear that their legacy belonged to those who had earned it through honesty and loyalty, not manipulation. They didn't celebrate the decision, nor did they gloat. Instead, they treated it as a correction, a mistake finally undone. She, however, didn't take it with such grace. Her visits became less frequent, her calls shorter, her voice sharper. Eventually, she stopped coming altogether. The woman who once paraded herself as the heart of the family was now nothing more than an outcast, whispered about with pity by the very people who had once admired her. I didn't revel in her downfall, not outwardly. But inside, there was a quiet satisfaction. She had stolen from me, not money, but dignity. And I had taken it back without raising my voice, without breaking my composure. I hadn't needed to invent lies or fight her openly. All I needed was patience and truth proved to be the deadliest poison of all. Standing in my parents' home one evening, I looked around at the familiar walls, the photographs of our lives, the reminders of years of loyalty and love. For a time I had feared losing all of it, not because of what was written in a will, but because of what it symbolized. Yet in the end, nothing she did could erase who I was to my family. Her mask had slipped, and what lay beneath had destroyed her from within. Revenge wasn't about watching her suffer, it was about restoring balance. She had poisoned the trust of those I loved most, but that poison had turned on her, slowly, inevitably. And as I watched the calm return to my parents' eyes, I knew the battle was over. She had lost. I had won. The inheritance was mine again, but more importantly, so was my place in the family. And she was left with nothing but the ruins of the empire she had tried to build on deception. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal and revenge, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life. Don't miss the next twist waiting just around the corner.